Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Before I really get started, I just wanted to throw something out there really quick. So the years throughout the presentation are going to be really off. The order of it's just like all over the place, and that's just because, to begin with, it took place in like the BCE era, and that's already kind of backwards as it is. So just bear with me uh, for the next few minutes or so. We got this. But anyway, so I'll be doing a little bit on Plato from 427 BCE when he was born to his death in 347 BCE. So Plato's education, I didn't actually have a set date for this, and that was just because I felt Plato was like a lifelong learner. But in terms of his earlier education, he definitely had, or I feel like he definitely had a more privileged education. That was just because he was often being tutored by these well-known philosophers at the time, such as Pythagoras and stuff like that. So from a young age, he was always like intellectually stimulated and curious, which probably led to his, future career in philosophy and interest in politics and that kind of stuff. So there's that. Um, So the idea of the philosopher king came about in Plato's dialogue of the Republic, and this kind of showed like Plato's how he was just not a fan of like a democracy, and that's just because like a democracy kind of required like anyone and everyone to participate, and by that it's just like whether you were educated or not. So what the philosopher king was is actually just like a person who was actually intellectually capable, prepared and trained for their position to lead a society. Whereas, as opposed to having a democracy where everyone's just kind of like, throwing their hands yes or no, whether they know what they're talking about or not. Um, so it's kind of like the same way that you would want to go to like a doctor who's had the actual like the proper training, who's done the years, who has the credentials, the certificates or whatever, all that good stuff, rather than someone who's just like sticking doctor in front of their name kind of thing. So that was kind of like the idea of the philosopher king, which I'll kind of touch back on it a little bit later um, in the presentation if it comes up. All right. So Plato lived through the age of 80 to the age of 80, and he died of natural causes. Um, and although he died a really long time ago, his philosophy still survives today. He had a lasting impression and influence on his peers, which we still hear of today, such as peers and students, I guess, such as Aristotle and stuff like that. Another thing I want to throw out there, it says 348 BCE here. In the beginning, it said 347. Because this took place such a long time ago, it's kind of hard to find like concrete, like primary evidence to show like an exact date. So again, 347, 348, time of death, approximately. Yeah. Okay, so um, so 380, Plato founded the Platonic Academy, which is kind of like a school. I don't know if any of you recognize this painting here. This is like the School of Athens. It's a fresco that is found in the Vatican. Actually, it was painted by Raphael or Raffaello Sanzio in 1509 and 1511. So this was years after Plato, obviously, but this is the artist kind of like just what he imagined it to be like, I guess. And if you guys get a chance, I would kind of recommend just like looking it up. I don't know, it's kind of cool to look at sometimes and like try and figure out who's who in the painting. I didn't get to too many, but just like the big ones, I guess. So this guy on the left here in the middle is actually supposed to be Plato. The guy to his right is supposed to be Aristotle, and this guy over here is said to be Socrates, which I'll mention him a little later as well. But the two were, well, Socrates was like his mentor and friend, so it was kind of nice that It was also included in there. But yeah, so this is supposed to represent Plato's Academy, um, which was around for about 900 years until 529 BC. But again, it allowed for many philosophers that we recognize today, such as Aristotle, to kind of come together and just, get all their thinking done that we know of today. So, throughout 398 and 380 BCE, Plato traveled a lot through parts of Italy, Egypt, and Syracuse, which is also in Italy. But during his trip to Syracuse, where he was friends with the king of the region, he actually made a couple trips back and forth there. But for a couple of them, he was actually there to tutor one of the nephews of the king in the ways of becoming a philosopher king. So the nephew was to take over later, but it didn't really work out, ended up. But the point is, so Plato kind of came up with not necessarily like a curriculum, but just like supposed steps to become like a philosopher king kind of thing. But like I said, didn't work out with the king, but he did it. And yeah. So philosophy over everything. So Plato was he was like a dabbler of all sorts kind of thing. So he in his earlier days was into like playwriting and stuff like that, and also kind of was into politics, but after like Socrates' death and that kind of stuff, it kind of really turned him off, and he turned away from that and decided to focus more on, well, not after Socrates' death, but he ended up focusing more on philosophy and that kind of stuff. But even then, he explored multiple subjects such as political theory, theology, cosmology, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. Epistemology, it's a fun word. It's actually just like, we'll just elaborate a little bit, but so epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge, justification, and the rationality of belief. Keep that in mind. You might need it later. Anyway, so yeah, like I said, he was kind of like a dabbler of all sorts, but philosophy over everything, and we kind of still see that today. So Plato and Socrates, as I mentioned earlier, they met back in 407 BCE, which at the time Plato was probably like around his 20s, if that. But sorry guys. So Plato kind of followed Socrates around after, like they met. Like he was really inspired by him and his way of thinking, like the Socratic method kind of thing. So Plato definitely followed him around. He was one of like his loyal followers and kind of stuff. And while Socrates was going on through the trial, it's believed that Plato was considered one of the youth that Socrates was corrupting and stuff like that. And after he was sentenced to death, Plato actually fled Athens, along with like some of Socrates' other followers, in fear of being persecuted because of that. And I guess we're ending with Plato being born in 427, which again, BCE. That was actually supposed to be the first one, obviously. But again, going back to his family ties, his father was believed to come from, well, they both were believed to come from like noble backgrounds. His father having ties to Cadrus, the former king of Athens, like way back when, like I'm talking like 1089 BCE kind of thing, like way back. And his mother having ties to a lawmaker and lyric poet Solon. Oh, and that's it. Thank you for stopping by. Hope you